Thanks. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. I know many of you, and I know of your good work in the community, and some from a long time ago. And so it's really an honor to be here to talk about a restorative justice initiative that we're starting with the City of Seattle, and to share a little bit about restorative justice, about one practice, and then really to engage with you around what it would be like to be involved in a restorative circle, a restorative justice practice, and then how we might envision that for our city and for our communities. So a little more about me. I wanted to let you know my background, just because I think it might relate to some of you, which is to say I spent 20 years working as a civil rights and employment lawyer, and was doing very good work in the community in terms of enforcing civil rights and representing people whose rights had been violated. Sexual harassment, other kinds of discrimination, often serious violations and physical injuries, deaths. And that work was so important and remains so important in our rights-based system. And yet, the more I became successful in this work, the more I became discomforted with the contrast between what I was doing and the goals I was seeking. So people would come to me for justice because something really wrong had happened in their relationships or in their worlds. And yet, as much as I tried to bring them some relief and some justice, I often brought them to war. And it was a conflict that I began to become so uncomfortable about, I realized I couldn't do this anymore. That what I really wanted to do was find a way to engage some of our most significant conflicts that is consistent with my beliefs and with our values of being in this together, of approaching things in a way that is nonviolent, that actually meets the needs of everyone involved. Because I actually believe that sometimes bad things happen for good reasons. Sometimes we have to come together and learn from our mistakes. And most of the time we can find a solution that's that higher level solution that does meet everyone's needs. So it's an optimistic approach, but I was really seeking a way that instead of conflict resulting in more disruption, because often our litigation system really, as an adversarial truth by cross-examination model, tore people further apart. And especially when I was working with people who were in employment situations or in situations that they really cared about the others, that was just devastating to watch that happen. So I started exploring restorative justice and fell in love with a particular practice, a restorative justice practice called Restorative Circles, that was developed by a man named Dominic Barter in Brazil. And he developed this, he's a Brit who was living in Brazil, and developed this with the assistance of youth and others in communities in the favelas outside of Rio, where the traditional systems of policing and courts didn't even touch because it was so dangerous. These are very steep hillside communities where the drug trade and youth with very significant weaponry really had the lay of the land, with a lot of consequences of violence in their own communities. And so with them, he developed this way of engaging conflict that is very, very simple and very wonderful. And it ties into what we know as humans, which is that when conflict happens, we have this longing to sort of set things right. If it happens in a family or in an organization or anywhere, we have this desire really to set things right. And our indigenous people and traditional societies often have ways of doing this, circle processes or other kind of conferencing processes. And somehow in our Western traditions, we have lost a lot of those other traditions of how we come together as community for healing. And so what this restorative justice work is a way of remembering what it is to be in community, remembering what it is to engage with one another around things that don't feel good, that are painful, that are devastating often. But how do we make sense of those things? How do we set them right? And how do we move forward in a way that may actually build So technically, restorative justice really is a way of looking at conflict that is a relational way of looking at justice. So our traditional systems are rights-based. We look at what was done, and we typically figure out who's to blame, how can we prove it, and how can we punish it. And in the criminal world, that's often through prison. In the civil world, often it's through financial compensation. In schools and other settings, it's often through suspension or expulsion. So we have a tendency to push people away. Okay? Restorative justice takes a look at harm as being between people and in relationships. And so you look at it a little bit differently. So something has happened, something's occurred, but what you look at is then who was impacted? What's the community that was impacted by that harm? And then what are the consequences of that? What are the underlying needs and consequences of what happened? And then you take a look at who is responsible for those. Who can and will make a change to repair those needs. To repair the harm, to restore a sense of well-being, and maybe to do something to help prevent this from happening in the future. And then you create some sort of collective action to make that happen. So you're looking at a respectful process. There are many of these processes, most of which are facilitated dialogue processes of some sort, where people take responsibility for what they did and for the conditions in which these things occurred, and figure out what is to be done to set it right to the extent possible. So here we have an opportunity in our city, and it's exciting because we are seeing, I think, signs of the old way that aren't working, and they're not working in often, I think, very painful ways. So we see that our society institutionalizes people or puts people in prison at far greater rates than any other country in the world. Right? We know that there's disproportionality in how we do that. So our minority populations, or people who are people of color, are more often those in the prison system than is reflected in their population percentage in the population in general. We also know that in our schools, the traditional way of doing discipline has been to suspend and expel people. We know that when that happens, 3 times more likely, a person who's suspended will get involved in the criminal justice system, and their success rate in school goes down. So we see that type of discipline in the school system isn't leading to academic success, and it's also not leading to success of humans in our community. It's leading toward the criminal justice system. And we know that when people are involved in the criminal justice system, the effects of that last for a lifetime, both in terms of employment difficulties, in terms of being disenfranchised from voting, in terms of difficulties socioeconomically and otherwise. So we see some of the effects of our old ways, our more punitive ways of dealing with conflict. And so the question is, could we imagine a way in which we as a community could use a more restorative approach, where we hold accountability in an alternative way? So when something happens, it's not a free pass, but instead it's an accountability that really keeps people connected to the community, where there's a possibility for reconciliation, there's a possibility for forgiveness, there's a possibility for people to apologize and say they're sorry, there's a possibility for people to repair harm, and then to be reintegrated into the communities that they're part of, so they're not isolated or estranged. So what we're starting, and this is there's a proposal right now that we do a pilot project in the central part of Seattle. And this is still new. So one of the things that your organization can do is certainly to support this concept within our city government, because there's still some question as to whether we should do this or not. But the proposal would be to do a pilot project, not try to do everything at once, although the grand vision of having a parallel restorative justice structure is quite appealing, one that just exists on the, and is available at any level for anyone for any harm. I think we could build that, but how do we start? So we're looking at the central part of Seattle and the East Precinct, which is a police designation, as a way of enrolling police and the judicial system, frankly, in one organizing way. It's central district, but also Capitol Hill and Leschi and Madrona and Montlake and all those parts in that central core. And the idea would be, how could we create different ways of bringing conflicts into a restorative practice instead of the criminal justice system, instead of school suspension, and instead of issues escalating in the community where they either become criminal or there might be an escalation of violence or where people are simply discomforted. So looking at ways where community has access to a restorative system, where the police or the prosecutors or the city attorneys have access toward a restorative system, and where the schools might have access toward a restorative system. And creating a centralized place where we can both support that happening and then also support these communities and engage in conflict on their own, in their own way. So we're looking at targeting those who are 24 and under, so the youth of the community, so having conflicts that occur there that involve someone of that age. And it's not necessarily the youth who have created the harm, but also maybe those who've been impacted by the harm. We're looking at 24 and under because it's both the juvenile system, and I think we in our society have a great sense of hope that kids will be kids and they will grow up differently and they need to learn from their mistakes. But we also know that the neurobiology suggests the prefrontal cortex is not fully formed until 25. So the young adults are also, I think, in a position where we as society could say, yes, of course they could learn from mistakes, and we as society should wrap around these things differently. Frankly, I think adults can learn from their mistakes too. So we're just starting here as a pilot, but because we need to have some parameters. But if this is successful, perhaps we could later expand to any conflict, any age, and certainly any part of the city. And we're looking at a diversion program, first of all, to try to keep people out of the criminal justice system in the first place. Okay, so police could refer, or others could refer, as an alternative to the criminal justice system for misdemeanors, gross misdemeanors, and possibly low-level felonies, and that's part of what we're negotiating right now. We're also looking at community centers as being hubs for practice so that they could involve a restorative practice instead of having to call the police or having some sort of engagement if things go awry in the community centers, because they see their job as really keeping people connected to community and they don't want to have to involve the system if they don't have to. And similarly in communities where they recognize the consequence of having some sort of a criminal response could be more severe than they need, allow community to also do some referrals of cases. And so that's really what we're up to, starting there. It's also very important in the restorative justice world that we're clear that we're trying to meet the needs of everyone. So those who have done the harm, those who have been harmed, and the community. There are those three prongs of it. And so there's also, I also have this desire that we ensure if victims of crime at any level want to engage in a restorative process, that we allow for some sort of entry there as well. Because sometimes those people who have had the most significant losses with the highest level crimes are also those who want more information, who want to know why this happened, who want to engage with the person who caused this harm. And it won't be for everyone. These are all voluntary processes. But for those people whose healing would be helped by doing this kind of work, it would be great to have also a portal for them to be able to engage in a restorative process. So that's the dream, that's the vision, that's the pilot project that we're putting together. And I think it would be wonderful if, certainly I could take questions and such, but one of the things that we had talked about in preparing for this would be to do a semi-simulated circle, which is a way of showing you and having you actually experience what it might be like to be in a restorative circle process. And so I could use the process that I've learned from Dominic and have been practicing. And what we do is we take a live conflict that's actually happened for somebody, and it could be recent or not recent, but something that's meaningful. And usually that doesn't involve anyone else in the room. And what we do is a pre-circle with that, so you can see what the intake, kind of the initial process would be, because in the restorative circle process we use, there are 3 phases. We do pre-circles, so everyone who's involved in the circle has a chance of exploring what the incident is and the significance, the meaning of that for them. They have an opportunity to identify who needs to be present to engage the conflict, and then understand about the process so they can consent or decide they don't want to do it. Okay? So we would do pre-circles with everybody who's involved, and then we come together as a community in a restorative circle. And the process that I would like to share with you is a reflective dialogue one. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then after the restorative circle happens, where you address the harms, you end up with an action plan about what you're going to do to repair the harm, restore the relationships, take action to prevent this from happening again. And the action plans are very specific with, times and people who are responsible for what they're going to do. And depending on the timing, then you can figure out, well, when do we need to have a post-circle? Because we're not just going to promise we're going to do this. We're going to actually follow up with this. And in the post-circle, what we're doing is not focusing on the act that happened that was so devastating and caused the harm, but instead we're focusing on the action agreements. So we're saying, well, how did those action agreements, how are we doing in relation to those? Did they meet the needs that we identified before or not? Do we need to revise them? Or can we just celebrate it's done? Or are we going to be really mournful, actually, because it didn't work somehow, right? But it's a way of us as a community reflecting on this. And because we have that built-in action plan and the post-circle to look at whether or not that worked, that actually creates a nice accountability model that can be an alternative to what we could do otherwise in the criminal justice system or school suspensions or somewhere else. You see, people will take accountability. And the process is to have the group who was involved in the original restorative circle determine, was this done? Did they satisfy what was expected? And can we say we're done? And now they're fully integrated. Okay. Yeah?
So did you say there were 3 pre-circles, and there's one for the victim community, one for the perpetrator, and one for the community?
Yes, so the pre-circles are done with everyone who's going to be in the circle. And they can be done individually if there are a small number of people, or they can be done in groups if there are commonly situated people. So if you have a group of folks who've been harmed or a group of people who are similarly situated, you might have that as a collective. And this allows us really to actually scale this work as well. So you can imagine, Dominic used this initially in the community, but then his work spread to schools and to prisons and to the courts and other things. And I can only imagine what this was like, but he ended up being asked to facilitate a restorative circle after a prison riot. And the prisoners were upset about the conditions, and so there were prisoners, there were guards, and there were others who were involved. So to be able to scale it in a way that there are a couple of people who might speak for the group, but the rest of the group could actually observe and be part of it, it's quite powerful. So the whole community can theoretically experience this and yet have a manageable group and dialogue process. So yes, you have the pre-circle first with the person who initiates the circle. And one of the beautiful things about this model is having some openness so that anyone in a community can call a circle. So if you were, for instance, to say as the Fellowship of Reconciliation, we do a lot of work of peace in the world, but when we think about our organization, do we have agreements about how we engage with one another if things go wrong? A lot of groups don't. Right? A lot of them don't. So then you think, well, how might we do that? So you might have a formal process like restorative circles, but you might also have some other agreements. I notice you do a centering at the beginning. So maybe your first agreement is, well, I'm going to center, when we have a conflict, we're going to each center with where we are and find out really honestly what our needs are and where we are in relation to that. And then maybe in our community we would say we would prefer to have some sort of a reflective dialogue process or a restorative conversation with a person that we're having conflict with to see if we can resolve it at that level. If that's a safe thing to do. Or maybe we would have an idea that we could have a facilitator engaged in a two-way conversation if that happens. But some conflicts involve more than one person. Some of them, a lot of conflicts involve the whole community. Sometimes we need a little bit more formal process. And then you might say, well, let's have a restorative, let's agree that this is available to us if we need it as a way to support our community going through these times. And so that if you do that, the beauty of this system is anyone should have access to being able to call a circle. Because everyone is responsible for the conditions that give rise, and they should share the power for maintaining the community, okay? So if anyone has access, anyone can initiate, whether it's the person who's caused the harm, or the person who's been harmed, or a member of the community who's observing something that is just out of sorts, and they don't want to engage that way anymore. So, and that can be quite powerful, because what we know is that sometimes conflicts, especially if they're between two people, and I think of ingrained conflicts and systemic conflicts, sometimes those people are so much involved in their own thing that that sometimes there's a power differential, sometimes they wouldn't necessarily call a circle or a process on their own. Right? But a community member might say, hey, this is really impacting you, this is impacting the family, we don't like to see it this way, I want to have a process around it. So the restorative circle process itself then involves everyone coming together, and usually we have two facilitators, and there's a reflective dialogue component to this, where instead of speaking to one person and then having them respond, like in a normal dialogue, instead what we do is we ask people to speak to one person, and that person to listen and respond back what they heard them say. And so not just the words, but the deeper meaning, the essence of what was being said. And then you check in to make sure that was correct. And by slowing down the conversation that way, we really ensure that there's shared meaning. And we allow people to step in the shoes of the other person just for that moment. You're not asking them to agree, you're simply asking them to make sure they understand what's going on. And you know, when people are really hot about something, this is really important, because often we don't really understand what someone's saying, or our impressions of what they said could be a little bit wrong. So there's that piece of communication and the shared meaning that's really critical. And what we do is we start off with the right now. Where are you right now in relation to the event and its consequences? And so what you might get are the emotions, the feelings, the separation people have, the anger, maybe the distrust, the fear of retaliation, but also the consequences, like this has really screwed up my life. I'm so upset, and some listing of the consequences of what happened. And so that can be shared, and everyone has an opportunity to share that. And if it doesn't happen naturally, which it often does, you can also then go to another round, which is looking at the past, looking at the time of the incident itself, and asking, what would you like known, and by whom, about what you were looking for, what you were seeking at the time you chose to act. So you can ask the person who's caused the harm, what happened, right? What were you looking for? What are your interests? What were your needs? Because sometimes people do a bad thing for a good reason. You know, I might have taken that because no one had eaten in my family for the day. I might have been late because I was getting the other siblings ready for school, or the car broke down. So by asking the question, you get to some of those underlying interests and needs. But you also ask that of everybody else in the community. What were you seeking or hoping for when you acted or found out about what happened? And so people can also sort of clue into what their sense of interest, needs, responsibility is there. And in that self-responsibility round, people sort of surface all sorts of aspects, because often harm is caused by one person if you take that snapshot in time. But really, it's so interrelated to other conditions in which it happens, or maybe, you know, right beforehand somebody else had done something, or the consequences of another act. Sometimes you see there are generational harms. Sometimes you see there's trauma that's been lives for many, many years. So those things can arise. And then in the action planning phase, we have an opportunity to offer or to request what's to be done next. And so everyone can participate in helping to make this right. So what I wonder is whether, first of all, you have any questions in general about the process, and then secondly, whether there's anyone who would like to offer a live conflict. And what I would do is just demonstrate a pre-circle with that person, and we can all listen to what that might be like. And in that process, they'll identify some of the people who would need to be present to engage the conflict. And what I would ask then is for you to be willing to come up and play the role of those people. Not, an Academy Award presentation or anything else, but just who you are, if you understood those circumstances as mother or as friend or as that person, what it would be like. And then we can start to do a process, and you can get a sense of what it might be like. So if that sounds good to you, yeah? So, yes? Yeah.
Well, how do you define community? When I walk through the central area,
Yeah.
the community itself that we really focus on in the central area doesn't feel the self-cohesion. When you put within the family, or within the church, or within the neighborhood, or within the city, and don't have this disparity. So how do you get them to believe that a community in order to do this work? There has to be a structural mechanism for the work to even get started.
Such a good question. So how do you define community, and there needs to be a structural mechanism, and really there has to be a sense of identity, I think, identification with community. And I would say that's maybe the hardest thing for me in doing this work, is that community, I might say it in the singular, but I don't mean it in the singular. I mean it in the multiple. So there are many communities. We have, if you think about the communities you identify with, there are probably family communities, there's organizational communities like the fellowship, there might be workplace communities, there might be neighborhood or geographically based communities. So all of those communities are relevant. And in any of those communities, one could say very intentionally, we want to explore how we live together in community. And when we have conflicts, we want to have a range of restorative options. And we really want to practice how it is to engage in a positive way, in a nonviolent way, in a restorative way when these things happen. And so, so you can imagine families doing that. You can imagine others. What we're doing with the pilot project is really looking at kind of a combination of things. Looking at communities that already self-identify as communities, and also looking at systems where there are accountability structures in place that are punitive, and we're trying to make them more restorative, okay? So it's a bit of a blend. And the invitation really is for those who want to participate at a level they want to participate in. So for the systems level work, like the criminal justice diversion programs, that's really more of a systems intervention, okay? It's an alternative accountability model. And whether people believe they're part of the community or not, we're looking at things like their age and the geographic location of the crime and other things. So we're saying it's a community sort of by those factors. People may or may not identify with it, okay? And I'm not saying they do, and I can't say that they do or don't. So that is a bit challenging, but it's more of a systemic alternative approach. But where I'm working with community centers, it's kind of a different thing. Or with the high schools or the middle schools, it's a different thing. So schools are interesting because people really do identify with being part of the school. I mean, I'm an alumni of Garfield High School, 1983, and when I'm working at that school, I let them know that because I think that's really important. And my daughter may go to school there next year because she'll be in the 9th grade, and I live in the neighborhood. So all of a sudden it becomes important, and anyone who's been in that school or who is a student there feels an identity, and the teachers feel an identity. So schools, you get the sense, oh wow, there is a community there, and they think of one another as being part of a whole, and it's transient, and people are only there for 4 years at a time, or less, depending on what happens. But we want them there for 4 years at a time. And so that's a nice organizing body, really, because they see themselves as connected, all right? The community centers are interesting too. So I've been working with Yesler Community Council and then some folks around the Garfield Community Council. And that's interesting because around Yesler there are there's the Housing Authority and some low-income housing, and there are a number of agencies that serve there, and there are a lot of communities that are served in that area. A lot of refugee and immigrant folks are there, and others in that neighborhood. So a little more cohesion as community in that they live there, but also a lot of disruption in that community because they're going through changes in their housing and other things. So a challenge. And then certainly where we have religious organizations, churches, or families that want to participate in this network, those might be communities that would want to participate, have their own systems, and then also help to support the others. Looking at having facilitators and partners who can both be there in terms of supporting this work and also participating in these circles, but also, you know, the community organizations that serve, or the arts organizations that serve. So if a youth was involved in something that shows a real need for some identity or some greater positive, you know, they're involved in this and that was sort of a negative social engagement. If they want more belonging or a sense of connection to something more positive, can we link them to organizations in the community that help to build that? So you might have nonprofit organizations or clubs or others where they can develop a sense of identity and belonging. But I think it's a really good point, because part of the work that we're doing is figuring out how we engage conflict in communities. But if people don't believe they're part of communities at all, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle. And so my hope is that by doing this, people actually see themselves as more connected to community. They see themselves as actually being loved by others in their space. That, yeah, I live here, but now I know that you really care about me. I'm in this family, but now I know that you really do want me to succeed. I know I'm in this school, but this is the first time we've actually had a conversation and I've been able to share with you what's going on for me, and you actually care. So it's by slowing down and finding an excuse to have us get together in a format, in a process for doing that, that I believe we actually will connect better as community and ultimately bind in more resilient and connected communities. Yeah.
Are there enough history or previous data, you know, to say whether this is whether the offenders reoffend? Mm-hmm. So are we getting better outcomes after in the following years than the criminal justice system?
Right. So, you know, is there an evidence-based element to this? And yes, in a number of respects. So the facilitated dialogue practices that I'm talking about, there's the restorative circles that Dominic started. There are other restorative circle processes. There are family group conferencing models. And all of these are similar in a way. So looking at those as a whole, what you find is where they've been applied, yes, there often is a reduction in recidivism. Not in every study that they've done, but there are communities that are using this right now. Longmont, Colorado, some communities on the East Coast in Baltimore, where they have a reduction in recidivism, you know, far greater than any other system. And mind you, when you look at the traditional criminal justice system for juveniles, the sad thing is, by going through that system, they're far more likely to reoffend, because the shaming that happens there is an alienating one, and people somehow feel more detached from the system, and they get more connected to a criminal element as opposed to the positive elements. So yes, the recidivism rates have decreased. What you also see is a high rate of satisfaction of people who go through this work. So instead of, you know, a negative experience of dealing with the system, you have, you know, both those who would be traditionally considered offenders or victims, all of them saying, yeah, we actually feel, you know, 90–95% satisfied with what's happened. And there are also high rates of completion of these processes. So there's an action agreement, and people are completing them with high percentages in the other communities that have tried similar things. The thing that I find most interesting, maybe it's because of my background as having represented plaintiffs and people who've been really injured, is that victims of crime seem to have very high rates of improvement of symptoms of their trauma and see a greater sense of security in their communities having gone through these processes. And it makes sense to me, because it's part of the healing process to take some power and tell the truth and hear what others have to say and just look at something, you know, really head on. It's like that. It's the divine discomfort of having to come together and say, okay, what is this? We are now forever connected to one another through this tragic thing, but I need to know more. I need to know who you are now. And the people who've done this in the most profound ways are inspiring to me. And they're also, I mean, when you look at the statistics and the studies, there is like that pretty dramatic reduction of their stress symptoms. So I find that encouraging. It's a really victims' rights and victims-centered approach. A couple of other things. In New Zealand, they've completely turned around their juvenile justice system. So they don't detain people who are young. They instead do restorative practices based upon the Maori traditions there. So that's encouraging to me, as like a whole system shift, which is wonderful and aspirational, I think. And you know, and I guess the other one I was going to say is that the Restorative Circle process that Dominic Barter started, there was a study by a British think tank called Nesta, and they looked at social efficiencies in a lot of different areas, and they named this as one of 10 radical efficiencies because of the lower cost of engaging conflict and the benefits of it. So I would say yes, it's absolutely evidence-based. How we're putting this together in our community is going to be unique, because we're going to be using the talents and the skills that we have here to build a sustainable model. But I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing around the country and around the world, really, to say this makes sense, and it's going to be better for us, and hopefully will also save some money and be more effective. Yeah.
How does this flow down from the city? I mean, is this the mayor's office or the commissioners or the courts? How does it flow down? Who's measuring accomplishments?
So that's part of the pilot project is going to be, how do we create a structure around this, right? Yes. So what's happened? The way this started was, so the way this started came out of police community conflicts, and in particular, after the shooting of John T. Williams, our office started representing the family, and it was a horrific shooting, horrific harm, and great tragedy, and everyone in the city felt that. The surviving family members were also carvers, wood carvers, and when John T. Williams was shot, he was shot with a carving knife and a piece of wood as he was walking down the street. So the carving family then was in a very difficult situation because they have knives and they have wood. And the police officers were in a very difficult situation because some of them probably felt very badly about what was going on, and others were feeling really defensive about what was going on. So in the aftermath of that shooting, there were protests in the streets. It was getting very political. The family wanted their brother remembered for the carver he was. They wanted a peaceful response. And yet there were ongoing conflicts between the police and the family that they felt were very harassing and disrespectful and more of the same. And so they were worried, we were all worried that there was going to be something else that happened, another incident. And while the legal process was starting to march away, you know, on looking at the responsibility for what happened, what was the cause of crime, or what was the cause of death through the inquest process, there would be a criminal justice consideration. Were they going to file charges? There would be a civil rights case, you know, having to do with this. Though none of those processes, those official processes, could touch what are we going to do with how we coexist in this world now that this horrible thing has happened. So I was working with another lawyer in my office who started to do the inquest preparation, Tim Ford, and he says, would you go do your healing thing? And for me, you know, he recognized I'd come clean to him that I was doing some of this restorative work, and this was the perfect time really to try it. So what we did was to make a request to the police to say we'd like to have a meeting. There had been an accidental misunderstanding, which I think was lovely. The family had understood that the police chief wanted to talk with them, and it turned out that was a mistake. They had just been doing a lot of outreach into the Native American community after the shooting because they didn't have that many contacts. So they were, you know, the initial response was, no, that's an error. This would not be a good time to meet. There's all this legal stuff going on. And I said, well, you know, now that that's an expectation, maybe we should try it. And so to their credit at the time, we did it. We had a face-to-face sort of traditional meeting. Communication was fine, but it kind of went nowhere. And so I said, well, what if we try a restorative circle? What if we try this process and see if we can actually develop some better understanding and a plan for moving forward? And to their great credit, they said, yes, we'll do that. So 2 weeks after the shooting, we had a restorative circle with the police chief and the command staff, a sergeant who was a family friend of the carving family from the prior generations and who was well trusted by them, the family members, and then some members of the community. And we didn't talk about the shooting. The act that we talked about was some of these subsequent events that were between other officers and other family members. But by using those other events, we were able to get at all the issues we needed to get to about what was going on, what the underlying needs were, and how do we move forward. And so we had a 3-hour and very deep dialogue process, very uncomfortable at times and real and messy and very moving. And after that, and as a part of that, we ended up with a written action agreement. And that process really made a difference for the family and for the police in how they continued to work through this particular case, because it took a long time and there were a lot of places along the way it could have gone awry. But relationships did start to form. Some mutual understanding and respect started to develop. They started to make some changes in terms of how they dealt with that family and how they started to deal with other things. And it wasn't the end all and be all. There's been the Justice Department and the findings, and the monitor is now active, and there are a lot of other changes happening that arose in part from that shooting. But that circle made a real difference in how that community and that family worked through these issues and was able to do that without being further devastated by the process. So with that in mind, the question was, how can we do more of that? Right? And I continued to have a dialogue. And so we went up to Victoria, BC. The prior chief and some others from the administration went up to Victoria, BC and took a look at their diversion project. They have a restorative process up there, sort of similar to what we're trying to create here. And I kept, working this angle just as a community member. And then when the director of professional accountability decided she wasn't going to re-up for her third term because of all the politics and the difficulty she would have being reappointed, they had an opening and a vacancy. And the recruiter called me and said, what should we be looking for, and would you be interested in applying? And at the time I thought, oh my gosh, that's a thankless job. Why would I want to do policing of the police, right? That's crazy. But then the more I thought about it, I got somewhat obsessed by the idea of what if I worked from the inside trying to do the change I wanted to do? What would that be like? And so I decided to apply. And I said, okay, so here's the job, and here's the traditional disciplinary system, and it's very important that be strong. I can do that job, but if you chose me, I would want to do a restorative approach as well. A restorative practice both within the disciplinary system, but also in general with police and community. So I was just dreaming out loud and saying, I have a different vision for how we might approach this. And Mayor McGinn at the time was listening to this and said, well, what if we have somebody else do that job? And what if you just start a restorative justice initiative for the city of Seattle? So for me, it was a miracle, really. And I said, okay, that would be interesting. But of course, it was at the tail end of his term, and there was a lot of uncertainty. I said, okay, but if I do this, I would want this to outlast any particular mayor. I don't want this to be political. It can't be a campaign issue. It's going to take a while to develop. And so that was an agreement. And so I started. And this last budget round, I had hoped that we would be in the budget, and we weren't, because, so I'm not in the budget for this full year. But what happened was the city council said, look, this is new. We don't like the way this started. We weren't involved in all the politics, but we like restorative justice, so come back with a proposal. And so the police department has provided some bridge funding. And so what's happening now is we're going to go back with a proposal that's a little bit more developed, because it wasn't developed enough at the time we went, and for various reasons it wasn't there. So that's that's basically where we are. So getting the complete buy-in and agreement and structure and how do we measure and how do we fund and who will our partners be is part of what the discernment will be of council now and the new mayor.
So,
yes.
That means you will go to the full council, or will you go to Harold's safety committee?
Yeah, the expectation is Harold Safety Committee. It's not scheduled yet, but there would be a hearing, and anyone who wants to be there, I'm sure they would love to have. Yeah, and then there would be a budget consideration as part of the fiscal year 2014 supplemental. Hopefully sooner rather than later. And so there's been a little bit of it's unusual that this happened. Is unusual. And so it's a little awkward, and it's a little bit awkward making, doing the work in the community, because you can't promise too much now because it's under development. So it's interesting, but it's also very exciting to be thinking of how do we do an innovative piece of work and how do we start it. And so I've just felt really fortunate to have had the opportunity, and am continue to hold the vision, even though the uncertainty sometimes can be troubling. Yeah.
Thank you.